The car rolled slowly down the quiet street, the engine's hum soft against the backdrop of the peaceful suburban neighborhood. David kept both hands on the steering wheel, glancing occasionally at Rachel, who was sitting beside him, her face a mix of anticipation and nervousness. The back seat held Lily, wide-eyed with excitement, and Ethan, swinging his feet impatiently. The small house at the end of the street, with its neatly trimmed lawn and white picket fence, was their new beginning. Rachel smiled faintly, looking out at the house. Looks even better than the pictures. Lily pressed her face against the window, eyes wide. "It's so big," she exclaimed, turning to her brother. Ethan, less enthusiastic, gave a half-hearted shrug, still staring out the window at the unfamiliar street. As David turned off the car, Rachel stepped out, stretching after the long drive. The neighborhood felt still, almost too still. Her eyes swept over the nearby houses, noticing the immaculate lawns, the uniformity of the homes. Yet there was something more. She caught a glimpse of curtains shifting, eyes retreating behind windows as if they had been watching their arrival, polite but distant. Her heart sank a little, but she forced a smile. "It's nice here," she said, her voice softer now. David came around the car, helping Ethan with his seatbelt. "Give it time," he said, catching the brief look on her face. "We've only just arrived. People need time to adjust." Rachel nodded, though she didn't say anything further. Instead, she walked toward the front door, fishing the keys from her bag. As she inserted the key into the lock, a gust of wind blew through the trees, rustling the leaves and carrying with it an air of quiet apprehension. Lily had already bounded out of the car, running excitedly to explore the yard. Ethan followed behind her, less eager, but still curious. Rachel took a deep breath and pushed open the front door. The house was still, untouched, waiting for life to be breathed into it. Boxes lined the entryway, the faint scent of fresh paint lingering in the air. "Let's start unpacking," Rachel said, more to fill the silence than anything else. David nodded, walking back to the car to retrieve the first box. As he passed by the large bay window, he caught a glimpse of an elderly woman standing at a window across the street. Her eyes were fixed on them, her expression unreadable. She stood there, unmoving, like a statue watching over her domain. Mrs. Harper. He had heard about her briefly from the realtor, a long-time resident of the neighborhood. He turned back to Rachel, who was now walking into the living room. "Looks like we've got a welcoming committee," David muttered, glancing back toward Mrs. Harper's window. Rachel followed his gaze, seeing the figure too. The older woman made no effort to wave or smile, merely stood watching. Rachel felt a shiver run down her spine, but she brushed it off, turning her attention back to their new home. "They'll warm up eventually," David said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Rachel didn't answer right away. "I hope so," she finally said, her voice quieter than before. The house felt too still, too empty, even with the promise of a fresh start. The day passed in slow motion, the family unpacking boxes and settling into their new space. Yet the sense of unease never quite left. Every time Rachel stepped outside, she felt the weight of unseen eyes on her. The polite smiles from the neighbors, though few, never seemed to reach their eyes. And every now and then she'd catch another glance of Mrs. Harper, still watching from her window, ever present, ever distant. By evening the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the street. The Wilsons gathered in the living room, their new home filled with the quiet creaks and groans of settling wood. But the air outside still carried that same tension, subtle but undeniable. Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, judged, though no words had been spoken. The morning air was crisp as Rachel led Lily and Ethan towards Rosewood Elementary, their new school. The faint crunch of fallen leaves beneath their feet was the only sound as they approached the entrance. Ethan, clutching his backpack, trailed behind, glancing nervously at the unfamiliar surroundings. Lily walked ahead with a bit more spring in her step, her natural curiosity outweighing the unease of starting at a new school. Rachel paused at the school gates, looking over at the small cluster of parents gathered near the entrance. They exchanged pleasantries amongst themselves, their laughter soft, almost intimate. She inhaled deeply, pushing aside her uncertainty. This was a chance to integrate, to establish a sense of normalcy. "Good luck today, kiddos," she said, kneeling down to hug them both. "It'll be fun. Just be yourselves." Lily gave her a quick nod before dashing off, her braid bouncing behind her. Ethan hesitated, his eyes darting between his mother and the unfamiliar schoolyard. Rachel gave him a reassuring smile. "You'll do great," she whispered. With that, Ethan took a deep breath and ran after his sister. Rachel watched them disappear into the school before turning toward the group of parents. As she approached, the conversations around her dwindled, the energy subtly shifting. They smiled, brief, tight-lipped smiles, but there was an unmistakable distance in their body language. "Hi," Rachel offered, raising her hand in a slight wave. "I'm Rachel Wilson. We just moved to Rosewood a few days ago." "Welcome," one of the women said, her smile polite but fleeting. "It's a nice town." The others murmured agreements, but no one made an effort to engage further. Rachel felt the weight of their sidelong glances, each word clipped, their attention quickly returning to their own circle of conversation. She forced a smile, nodding. "Yeah, it's been great so far. Still settling in, of course, but we're looking forward to getting to know everyone." "That's nice," another parent replied, her eyes already drifting back to her friends. Rachel stood for another few moments, waiting for an invitation that never came. After a few more awkward exchanges, she turned back towards her car, feeling the unmistakable coldness of polite rejection. The neighborhood felt welcoming on the surface, but beneath that exterior lay invisible walls. At the police station, David's experience wasn't much different. His first week as the new police chief in Rosewood had been uneventful in terms of crime, but the unease lingered in every conversation. The officers were courteous, professional, but there was something missing, a sense of camaraderie, a trust that had yet to form. David sat at his desk, reviewing the morning reports when Officer Brooks knocked on the door. "Chief, just checking in. Everything going all right?" Brooks asked, standing stiffly at the threshold. "Yeah, fine." "How's the patrol schedule shaping up?" David replied evenly, keeping his tone casual. "Running smooth?" Brooks said, though his eyes flickered nervously. "Anything you need from us, just say the word." "Appreciate it," David said, nodding. "Let's keep things steady for now." Brooks gave a curt nod and left the room, leaving behind an almost palpable tension. David leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He wasn't one to push his way in, but it was clear that for now he was still an outsider in their tight-knit station. Building trust here would take time, more time than he'd anticipated. Back at home, Rachel had decided to make another attempt at connecting with the neighbors. She brewed a fresh pot of coffee and placed a tray of muffins on the counter, glancing out the window as she waited. 2 women from down the street had accepted her invitation to come over, but their responses had been non-committal, more out of politeness than genuine interest. The doorbell rang, and Rachel quickly wiped her hands on a towel, opening the door to greet her guests. Mrs. Harper was there, standing with her usual stiff posture, accompanied by another neighbor, Anne. "Good morning," Rachel greeted warmly, stepping aside to let them in. "Morning," Mrs. Harper replied, her tone clipped as she scanned the house with a calculating gaze. Anne offered a thin smile but said nothing. Rachel poured the coffee and gestured toward the muffins. The conversation was stilted, full of pleasantries but devoid of warmth. Mrs. Harper barely touched her cup, her eyes lingering on the walls, the furniture, anything but Rachel herself. As the visit drew to a close, Mrs. Harper stood abruptly. "Well, thank you for the coffee. I should get going." Rachel smiled, though the gesture felt hollow. "Of course, any time." They left, their polite exits leaving behind an emptiness that Rachel couldn't quite shake. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees as Rachel stood at the kitchen counter, meticulously arranging plates and napkins. Outside, David was cleaning the grill, his focus sharp, but his movements unhurried. The air was filled with anticipation, the kind that lingers before an event where everything, or nothing, might change. "We've got this," Rachel said to herself, more as a mantra than a statement of fact. She glanced out the window at the backyard. Lily and Ethan were running around, tying colourful balloons to the fence, their laughter breaking the silence that usually hung over the neighbourhood. David came inside, wiping his hands on a rag. "Everything ready?" Rachel nodded. "I think so. It's just—" David leaned on the counter, raising an eyebrow. "Just what?" "I'm not sure if they'll actually come," Rachel admitted. "I mean, some said yes, but it didn't seem genuine." David sighed but didn't argue. "We did what we could. Now it's up to them." Earlier that week, they'd gone door to door, Rachel holding a tray of cookies, David offering a friendly smile. They had tried their best to appear approachable, eager to break the invisible barrier that had surrounded them since moving in. Some neighbors accepted the invitation with tight-lipped smiles and vague promises, while others made excuses about being out of town or having prior engagements. Mrs. Harper, however, had been a different story altogether. When Rachel and David arrived at her house, she had opened the door just enough to see them. Her expression was neutral, but there was a coldness in her eyes that Rachel couldn't quite shake. "We're having a little barbecue this weekend," Rachel had said, her voice bright but controlled. "It'd be great if you could join us. A chance to get to know everyone better." Mrs. Harper's gaze had lingered on them, her eyes shifting briefly to the tray of cookies before meeting Rachel's again. "I'm afraid I have other plans," she had said, her tone polite but her words final. "But thank you for the invitation." She closed the door before Rachel could respond. David had glanced at Rachel, but neither of them said a word as they walked back down the path. Now, as Rachel placed the final dish on the table, the memory of that brief interaction still lingered. "They'll come," David said to you, though his voice carried a quiet uncertainty. Few days later, the backyard was alive with the soft crackle of the grill, the warm scent of barbecue mingling with the crisp, early evening air. Rachel had finished setting the table with salads and side dishes, glancing over at David, who stood by the grill, expertly flipping burgers. Lily and Ethan were darting between the guests, their laughter cutting through the quiet conversations that floated around the small gathering. Despite the smiles and greetings, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling of something hovering beneath the surface. The neighbors who had come were polite, but there was an undercurrent of formality, a stiffness in the way they stood apart, clustered in their small groups, speaking in careful, measured tones. "Do you need anything?" Rachel asked, walking over to David as he adjusted the grill's heat. He shook his head, his expression calm but alert. "No, everything's good. Just keep an eye on things." Rachel nodded, understanding the subtle message in his words. They were hosting the party, but there was an unspoken divide, one that neither of them could bridge easily. From her spot near the patio, Rachel noticed Mrs. Harper. She stood by her window, her face partially hidden by the curtains, but there was no mistaking the disapproval etched into her features. She had declined their invitation days ago, but it seemed she had decided to attend in her own way, observing from a distance. Rachel's stomach tightened. She couldn't help but feel Mrs. Harper's eyes on them, like a weight pressing down on the atmosphere of the party. A soft murmur rose from one of the groups as a neighbor commented on the food. "The burgers smell great," one man said, offering a half-hearted smile. "I think I'll grab one." Rachel smiled in return, grateful for the small moment of normalcy. "Help yourself. There's plenty." But as she moved back toward the table, she noticed something in the way the other guests exchanged glances, polite, reserved, and distant, just like before. Across the street, Mrs. Harper's gaze didn't waver. She watched the gathering, the sounds of laughter and conversation drifting toward her window. The party had brought a break in the neighborhood's usual quiet, a change that she found unsettling. With a deliberate sigh, she picked up her phone and dialed. "Yes, I'd like to report a disturbance," she said, her voice calm but pointed. "There's a party happening and it's quite loud. I'm not sure what's going on, but it seems inappropriate. You might want to check it out." The sound of the grill hissing filled the quiet spaces between conversation, and for a moment, Rachel allowed herself to relax. Maybe it wasn't perfect, but at least they had taken the first step toward connecting with their neighbors. But that peace was short-lived. 2 police cruisers pulled up slowly to the curb, the flashing lights casting a harsh glow over the yard. Conversations halted, and the laughter from Lily and Ethan abruptly died as the officers stepped out, their presence casting a shadow over the gathering. David immediately set down the tongs, his face impassive but his jaw tight. He knew what this was. He exchanged a brief glance with Rachel before walking calmly toward the officers. "Evening, gentlemen," David greeted them, his voice level. "What can I do for you?" The officers shifted awkwardly, clearly not expecting to be greeted by the police chief himself. Chief Wilson," one of them said, straightening up. "We received a noise complaint about a gathering here." David nodded, his expression unchanging. "I see. Well, as you can tell, we're just having a small neighborhood barbecue. No issues here." The officer glanced around at the quiet gathering, the neighbors now standing still, watching with thinly veiled curiosity. He cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "It doesn't seem like there's anything out of line here," he admitted. "We'll let the caller know there's no problem." David gave a slight smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I appreciate that." As the officers turned to leave, Rachel let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The guests exchanged awkward glances, some muttering to each other, while others stood silently, unsure of how to continue. The party's earlier light-heartedness had been extinguished, replaced by a heavy, lingering tension. David walked back to Rachel, his face calm, but she could see the frustration in his eyes. "I knew it," he murmured quietly, his gaze flickering toward Mrs. Harper's window, where the curtain had shifted slightly. Rachel didn't respond. There was nothing to say. The message had been delivered, not in words, but in actions. The divide between them and their neighbors had only grown wider, the invisible walls now more apparent than ever. The house was quiet after the last guest left, the once vibrant sound of laughter and conversation replaced by an uneasy stillness. Rachel stood in the kitchen, staring blankly at the leftover plates and half-empty trays of food. The BBQ hadn't been a complete disaster, but it wasn't what she'd hoped for either. She rinsed a plate under the tap, the water running in a steady stream as her thoughts drifted. From the living room, she could hear Ethan's voice, bright and unaffected. "Do you think the neighbors will come over next time, Mom?" Rachel froze for a moment, the plate slipping slightly in her grip. She took a deep breath and forced a smile as she walked into the living room where Ethan and Lily sat. "Maybe, honey," she replied, her voice softer than she intended. "Some people are just busy." Ethan looked up at her with wide eyes, his innocence almost painful. "But we invited everyone. I thought Mrs. Harper would come. She didn't even wave." Rachel hesitated. She didn't want to burden Ethan with the complexity of why some neighbors hadn't come. "Sometimes people have other things to do," she said carefully. "It's not always personal." Lily, who had been quietly reading, looked up, her brow furrowed. "But it feels personal." Rachel glanced at her daughter, recognizing the keen awareness in her expression. Lily wasn't asking with the naivety of a child. She understood, even if she didn't fully grasp the depth of it yet. Rachel nodded slowly but didn't say more. How could she explain to her children the subtle ways people like Mrs. Harper could express rejection without ever saying a word? David entered the room, his steps heavy as he joined Rachel on the couch. He hadn't said much since the police left earlier, but Rachel could see the tension in his jaw, the tightness in his shoulders. He sat down, rubbing a hand over his face, letting out a long, slow breath. "How are the kids?" he asked, though he already knew. "Ethan's fine," Rachel said quietly. "Lily's starting to notice things." David nodded. He had expected as much. Lily was too perceptive to miss the unspoken tension, the way their neighbors had kept their distance. He leaned back, staring up at the ceiling for a moment, lost in thought. "I thought it would be different," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Being the police chief, I thought maybe we'd be seen differently." Rachel shifted closer, resting a hand on his arm. "You thought the badge would change things?" David let out a short, bitter laugh. "Yeah, stupid, I know." "It's not stupid," Rachel said softly. "You're good at what you do. They'll see that." He shook his head. "Maybe. But right now, all they see is someone who doesn't belong." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of years spent dealing with the same quiet resistance, the same polite but distant rejection. It was nothing new, but it still stung. Rachel rested her head on his shoulder. "We're used to this, David. It's just harder now because we're trying to make this home." David didn't reply, but he placed his hand over hers, squeezing it gently. They sat there in silence for a long moment, the unspoken reality settling in around them. Later that night, after the kids had gone to bed, Rachel lingered in the hallway outside Lily's room. She could hear her daughter shifting in bed, the faint rustling of covers as she tossed and turned. Finally, Rachel pushed the door open and stepped inside. "Mum?" Lily's voice was quiet in the darkness. Rachel sat on the edge of the bed. "Couldn't sleep?" Lily shook her head. "I don't understand why Mrs. Harper didn't want to come. We didn't do anything wrong." Rachel's heart ached at the raw honesty in Lily's words. She brushed a hand over her daughter's hair, choosing her words carefully. "It's not about what we did, sweetie. Sometimes people, they have a hard time with new things. It doesn't mean we don't belong here." Lily's brow furrowed. "But it feels like they don't want us here." Rachel swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the conversation. "I know. And it might feel like that for a while. But we'll keep trying, okay? We'll show them who we are, little by little." Lily was quiet for a long time before finally nodding. "Okay." Rachel kissed her forehead, lingering for just a moment longer. As she left the room and closed the door behind her, she felt the familiar weight of unspoken truths settling back over her. The sound of children's laughter echoed faintly through the hallways of Rosewood Elementary as Rachel made her way to the front office, balancing a stack of books in one hand. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly, a low hum that filled the quiet spaces between the activity of the school. She'd started volunteering here a few weeks ago, her hope being that her presence might bridge some of the silent gaps that had formed since the family's arrival in Rosewood. As she entered the office, a few of the other mothers were gathered, chatting in subdued tones. One of them, Linda, offered her a half-smile as Rachel walked in. She had noticed that some of the parents were starting to acknowledge her a bit more, their standoffishness gradually giving way to cautious warmth. Others, like Mrs. Harper, remained cold, a polite but firm distance still firmly in place. "Hey, Rachel," Linda said, her voice friendly but reserved. "How's it going?" Rachel smiled, setting the books on the counter. "Busy, but good. How about you?" Linda nodded. "Same. You know there's a fundraiser next week. We could always use more hands if you're free." Rachel paused for a moment, surprised. It wasn't a full invitation into their circle, but it was a step. "I'll check my schedule, but I'd love to help if I can," she said, her voice genuine. The other women glanced over at her, offering small nods before resuming their conversation. Rachel lingered in the room for another moment before excusing herself, stepping out into the brisk fall air. It wasn't much, but it was something. At the station, David sat in his office, his eyes scanning a report as the low murmur of the team echoed through the building. He had been here long enough now that the initial frost had thawed, though the respect he had earned was quiet, never spoken aloud. Still, he could feel it. There was less hesitation in the way the officers approached him now, their conversations more fluid, less guarded. He had never been one to demand authority, preferring instead to lead by example, and slowly it seemed to be paying off. Officers nodded as he passed, their greetings more natural, their interactions smoother. "Chief," Officer Brooks knocked gently on the doorframe, stepping into David's office. "Brooks," David nodded. "What's up?" "Just wanted to update you on the patrol schedules," Brooks said, placing the paper on David's desk. "Everything's on track." "Good. Let me know if anything shifts," David replied, keeping his tone calm but firm. Brooks lingered for a moment, then nodded and left the office, leaving David alone with his thoughts. That weekend, Rachel stood in the backyard, surveying the empty patch of soil she had cleared near the fence. The idea of starting a community garden had come to her after the BBQ, a way to bring the neighborhood together in a more subtle, less direct manner. She knew it would be a slow process, but she was willing to try. David walked out, hands tucked into his jacket pockets. "You're really going through with this, huh?" Rachel smiled, wiping the dirt from her hands. "I am. It's a start. If we can get just a few people involved." David raised an eyebrow, his skepticism mild but present. "You think anyone will join in?" "They might," Rachel said softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "People like seeing something grow. Maybe if they see the garden, they'll want to help." David studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right. Let's see where this goes." She bent down, placing the first seed in the ground, covering it carefully with soil. It was a small gesture, but it felt significant, like planting hope itself in the earth. By the following week, a few of the neighbors had begun to take notice. Anne, from down the street, walked by one afternoon as Rachel knelt in the garden. "Starting a little project here?" Anne asked, her tone neutral but not unfriendly. Rachel looked up, offering a small smile. "Yeah, I thought it might be nice to have a garden everyone could contribute to." Anne lingered for a moment, as if considering the idea. "I've got some tomato plants that I've been meaning to plant. Maybe I'll bring them over." Rachel's heart lifted slightly. That would be great. As Anne walked away, Rachel stood, brushing the dirt from her knees, feeling the weight of something new, a tiny shift, but one that carried potential. Mrs. Harper still passed by without so much as a glance, her indifference cold and unyielding, but Rachel didn't let it discourage her. She would keep planting, keep trying. The sun was lower in the sky as Rachel knelt in the garden, her fingers pushing the soil aside to make room for another seedling. The small plot had begun to take shape over the past few weeks. Rows of vegetables and herbs, carefully arranged, though still sparse. Rachel found peace in the quiet work, even if the garden was slow to grow, just like the community's willingness to engage. From across the street, Mrs. Harper stood on her porch, arms folded tightly across her chest. Rachel had noticed her watching more frequently now, though there was no friendliness in her gaze, just the same cold disapproval. Every now and then, Rachel could hear Mrs. Harper's muttered complaints, talking to the older residents of Rosewood about how the neighborhood was changing too fast and how some people don't know how to leave well enough alone. Rachel tried not to let it get to her. She turned back to her work, focusing on the plants in front of her. If she let every bit of resistance sink in, the garden would never grow. Later that afternoon, as Rachel gathered her tools, a neighbor approached. It was Sarah, a woman who lived just a few houses down. She was quiet, rarely one to strike up conversation, but today she stood at the edge of the garden, a small potted plant in her hands. "Hey, Rachel," Sarah said, her voice soft but hesitant. "I was walking by and thought maybe this would be a good addition." She held out the plant, a small tomato seedling, its leaves bright and healthy. Rachel stood, brushing the dirt from her hands. "That's really kind of you, Sarah. Thank you." Sarah offered a tentative smile. "It's no problem. I've been meaning to plant it, but, I'm not much of a gardener." She glanced at the garden, her eyes lingering on the neat rows. "You've done a great job here." Rachel smiled warmly. "It's coming along. Slowly, but it's coming." Sarah nodded, setting the plant down near the garden's edge. "I'll stop by and help sometime, if you need it." "I'd love that," Rachel said, meaning it. It was a small gesture, but it felt like something, an olive branch maybe. As Sarah walked away, Rachel allowed herself a moment to feel the quiet satisfaction of progress, however small. At school, Lily sat at lunch with her usual group of friends, chatting about the upcoming weekend. The cafeteria buzzed with noise, the familiar clatter of trays and the hum of overlapping conversations. She felt mostly comfortable here, more settled than when she had first arrived. But that comfort faltered when one of her classmates, a boy named Matthew, made a comment that cut through the noise. "So, do your parents ever talk about why you guys moved here?" he asked, his tone light. But there was something behind it, something Lily hadn't noticed before. Lily frowned. "Why do you ask?" Matthew shrugged, playing with the straw in his drink. "I don't know. My mum said it was weird that you guys moved into Rosewood. Like, why this neighborhood?" Lily felt a flush of heat rise to her face. She had never thought much about why they moved. It was a new opportunity for her dad, a new start for their family. But now, the way Matthew said it, it felt like a challenge, like there was something wrong with them being there. "I guess because we liked the house," Lily said, her voice quieter now. Another girl at the table, Megan, looked up from her sandwich. "My parents said the same thing. They said your family's different from the people who usually live here." Lily's chest tightened. She didn't know how to respond, so she didn't. She looked down at her tray, suddenly feeling very out of place, her appetite gone. The rest of lunch passed in a blur, her friends continuing their conversation as if nothing had happened, but Lily felt the weight of those words long after the bell rang. That evening, as Rachel prepared dinner, Lily sat quietly at the kitchen table, drawing absent-mindedly in a notebook. She hadn't mentioned what happened at school, but the unease lingered in her movements, the way her fingers gripped the pencil too tightly. "Everything okay, sweetie?" Rachel asked, glancing over at her daughter. Lily hesitated, then shrugged. "I guess." Rachel wiped her hands on a towel, coming over to sit beside her. "You sure? You seem a little off today." For a moment, Lily didn't speak. Then, in a soft voice, she said, "Some kids at school were asking why we moved here. They said it was weird." Rachel's heart sank. She had expected something like this might happen, but it didn't make hearing it any easier. "What do you think about it?" she asked, keeping her voice calm. Lily frowned, her pencil still. "I don't know. It's like they're trying to say we don't belong." Rachel reached out, gently touching her daughter's arm. "People can be scared of things they don't understand. That doesn't mean they're right." Lily looked up at her, the uncertainty still in her eyes. "Will it get better?" Rachel nodded, though she knew it would take time. "It will. Little by little." As Lily returned to her drawing, Rachel glanced out the window at the garden, the first small plants just starting to push through the soil. It wasn't much, but it was something. The air was cooler than usual as Rachel arranged the chairs in their backyard, making sure there was enough seating for everyone who had agreed to come. It wasn't a large space, but she had made it work, setting up a small table with drinks and snacks, hoping this gathering would feel different, better than the last one. She glanced over at David, who was lighting the grill with the same quiet determination he always carried, though his posture was a bit tenser today. Lily and Ethan were inside, helping set up the last of the decorations. They were excited, of course, but Rachel felt the familiar knot in her stomach, the uncertainty that had crept in since the first BBQ. She had invited everyone again, this time not with cookies and polite smiles, but with a more genuine request to talk. This wasn't just about getting to know each other anymore. This was about addressing what had been left unsaid. "Think they'll show?" David asked, not looking up from the grill. Rachel exhaled slowly. "I think so. Enough of them, at least." David nodded, his expression unreadable as he flipped a few burgers. The first guests began to arrive shortly after, filtering in one by one. Some were neighbors who had come to the original BBQ, their expressions more open this time, though still tinged with hesitation. Others had declined the first invitation but showed up now, perhaps sensing the gravity of this gathering. Linda and her husband were the first to walk over to Rachel. "Thanks for hosting again, Rachel," Linda said, her voice warmer than before. "We've all been talking, and I think this is a good idea." Rachel smiled, though there was a weight behind it. "I hope so. We just wanted to clear the air." As more neighbors arrived, the murmur of small talk filled the backyard. Rachel noticed the subtle differences this time. People stood closer to each other, their conversations less stilted. There was still an underlying tension, but it felt like everyone had come ready to talk, not just to attend out of obligation. David stepped forward, leaving the grill for a moment, and raised his voice slightly to catch everyone's attention. "Thanks for coming," he began, his tone measured but sincere. "We know things have been a little tense since we moved in, and we just wanted to address that. We'd like to hear from you, to have an open conversation." The group shifted. some neighbors exchanging glances, others nodding in agreement. The silence stretched for a moment before Linda spoke up. "I think a lot of us didn't know what to expect," she said, her voice carrying the weight of unspoken thoughts. "It wasn't personal, but we've all lived here a long time. New things take some getting used to." Rachel nodded, appreciating the honesty. "We get that. We weren't expecting everything to be perfect, but we did hope for a little more openness. It's been hard, feeling like outsiders." Another neighbor, Anne, spoke next. "I'll admit I wasn't sure at first either, but watching you guys, how you've handled everything, it's clear you care about this community as much as anyone." There was a soft murmur of agreement from a few others, and for the first time, Rachel felt a sense of real connection forming. But there was still one voice missing. From the back of the crowd, Mrs. Harper stood, her expression as rigid as ever. She had come, which had surprised Rachel, but she had remained silent until now. Slowly, Mrs. Harper stepped forward, the eyes of the group turning toward her. She cleared her throat, the sound sharp in the quiet backyard. "I haven't been kind," she began, her voice carrying a weight that surprised even her. "When you first moved in, I didn't want things to change. I've lived in this neighborhood for nearly 40 years, and I liked things the way they were." Rachel held her breath, unsure of what Mrs. Harper would say next. "I made a mistake," Mrs. Harper continued, her voice softer now. "When I called the police during your first BBQ, I acted out of fear, not out of any real concern. I'm sorry for that. It wasn't fair." The words hung in the air, a ripple of surprise passing through the crowd. Rachel felt her chest tighten, but it wasn't anger. It was relief, mixed with a quiet sadness for how long it had taken to reach this moment. "Thank you," Rachel said softly, stepping forward. "That means a lot. We don't want to change the neighborhood. We just want to be part of it." Mrs. Harper nodded, though her face remained drawn, as if the apology had taken more from her than she had expected. The atmosphere in the backyard shifted after that. Conversations picked up again, but they felt different, warmer, more genuine. People began to ask about the garden project, offering ideas, and Rachel found herself talking more easily, the words no longer feeling like a performance. By the time the sun began to set, there was laughter mingling with the smell of grilled food, and the tension that had once defined the space seemed to dissipate into the cool evening air. Mrs. Harper stayed for a while longer, quietly watching from her seat, though she didn't say much more. As the last of the guests began to leave, Rachel stood beside David, her hand resting on his arm. "I think we're getting there," she said quietly, watching as Mrs. Harper walked back across the street, her steps slower, less rigid than before. The garden was a burst of color, with tomatoes ripening on the vine, sunflowers towering over the rows of herbs, and the hum of bees filling the air. Rachel stood near the edge, watching as neighbors moved through the garden, picking vegetables, chatting with one another. It was hard to believe how far everything had come. The once empty plot had bloomed into something real, tangible. She smiled to herself, feeling a quiet sense of satisfaction. David joined her, wiping his hands on a cloth after tending the grill. "Looks like a good turnout," he said, nodding towards the growing group of neighbors gathered near the garden. Rachel nodded. "Yeah, it does." She glanced at him, the weight of their journey settling between them. "Hard to imagine it's the same neighborhood we moved into." David gave a slight chuckle, though there was no amusement in it. "Yeah, we've come a long way." He looked around, his eyes landing on Mrs. Harper. who stood a bit away from the others, as she often did, but not as distant as she had been before. Rachel followed his gaze, watching the older woman for a moment. She had been the hardest to reach, the one who had made it clear from the beginning that the Wilsons didn't belong in her version of Rosewood. Rachel hadn't forgotten the police call, the cool indifference at their first BBQ. But something had changed over time, slowly, almost imperceptibly. But it had changed. As the afternoon went on, neighbors gathered around the garden, laughing and sharing stories. Rachel moved through the group, talking with Linda, Anne, and a few others, the conversations easy and genuine now. It felt like a place they could finally call home. Eventually, Mrs. Harper made her way toward Rachel, her steps measured, her expression as composed as ever. Rachel tensed slightly, unsure of what to expect, but she smiled as Mrs. Harper approached. "Rachel," Mrs. Harper said, her voice steady but quieter than usual. "I wanted to say something. I've been thinking about it for a while now." Rachel waited, her smile softening, sensing the seriousness in the older woman's tone. "I wasn't fair to you or your family when you first moved here," Mrs. Harper continued, her eyes not quite meeting Rachel's. "I let my own assumptions, my own fears, get the better of me. I judged you before I even knew you." Rachel remained quiet, the words hanging in the air. It wasn't a dramatic apology, but there was weight to it, an acknowledgement that had been missing all this time. Mrs. Harper shifted slightly, her gaze finally meeting Rachel's. "I've seen how much you've done for this neighborhood, and I was wrong about you, about your family." Rachel felt a small tightness in her chest, a mix of relief and something deeper, something that had been waiting to release since the day they'd arrived in Rosewood. "Thank you, Mrs. Harper," she said quietly. "That means a lot." The older woman nodded, her face still composed, but there was a softness there now, a vulnerability she hadn't shown before. "You've made this place better," she added, before stepping back into the crowd, retreating in the way she always did, but not with the same distance. As the evening wore on, the sounds of conversation and laughter filled the backyard, the garden becoming a central gathering point for the neighbors. David stood by the grill, flipping the last of the burgers, while Ethan and Lily ran around, playing with some of the other kids. It was a scene that, months ago, had felt impossible. Rachel moved to David's side, leaning against him lightly. "We did it," she said softly, watching as their neighbors mingled together, the earlier tensions now a distant memory. David nodded, his eyes scanning the group. "Yeah, we did." He looked down at her, his expression thoughtful. "It wasn't easy, though." "No," Rachel agreed, thinking back to the difficult moments, the cold stares, the polite but distant conversations, the constant feeling of being outsiders. "But we kept going." David smiled at that, his hand resting lightly on her back. "Persistence," he said, the word carrying a sense of quiet triumph. "That's what got us here." Rachel looked out at the garden, now in full bloom, and the neighbors who had once kept their distance now standing together, talking, laughing. The barriers that had once seemed insurmountable were gone, replaced by something more real, more lasting. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the garden, Rachel and David stood together, watching their community, come together in a way they hadn't thought possible. The journey had been long, filled with challenges, but it had been worth it. In the end, they hadn't just become a part of Rosewood. They had helped reshape it, making it a place where everyone could feel welcome, where everyone belonged. Rachel glanced over at Mrs. Harper, who was now sitting quietly by the garden, watching the children play. It wasn't a perfect ending, nothing ever was, but it was enough. There was peace here now, a sense of belonging that had taken root just as deeply as the garden they had planted. David squeezed her hand gently. "We're home," Rachel smiled, feeling the truth of his words settle deep inside her. "Yeah," she said, her voice soft but certain. "We're home. Wow. What an incredible journey, right?" The story of the Wilsons is a powerful reminder of how persistence, kindness, and a little bit of faith can truly transform not just a family, but an entire community. It shows us that breaking down barriers takes time. But when we lead with understanding, real change is possible. If you found this story as inspiring as I did, be sure to give this video a thumbs up and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever experienced something like this in your own community? I'd love to hear your stories, and don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss out on more stories that touch the heart and make us think.